to be talking this week about integral models for human development and for leadership. And one of these models, it's called the human domains. And the human domains comes from the work of Ken Wilber, who is someone who has studied for many, many years integral development, the development of human beings in an integral way. I want to tell you a little bit of his story of how he came up with some of this, because I find it very telling of how we see the world. So he was working in a university at some point, and for those of you who have been affiliated with universities, many times when you are doing research, what they want you to do is to focus in a very particular, unique area of expertise. And so he was in this debate that he was trying to understand what was a human being, and they kept asking him to focus in one particular area, but he kept saying, but everything connects to everything. I can see the connection of biology to try to understand a human being. I can see the connection with sociology. I can see the connection with history, with with all these different areas of big areas of study that he could see the connections with. And so since he started getting a little frustrated, he decided to go out in the woods and go into a cabin for a couple of years to live there in isolation and to try to figure out this that started forming in his mind about what did it mean to be a human being. So in this couple of years, he only saw 5 people. One of those was his physician, who would come once a year just to check in on him to see if he was still alive. And anyway, so in this cabin, he would spread out all of his books and all of this information that he thought had pieces of the puzzle to try to understand what was a human being. And he reflected on this and reflected on this, and started seeing the connections between those different groupings of information and books that he had. And so he started grouping them in 4 different categories, which then later he called the 4 quadrants, which was what gave birth to integral theory. So some of what we're going to be studying is based on that reflection that he did. Then James Flaherty, who's the author of one of the articles that you read this week, started thinking about what is it, how does that apply to how we develop as human beings, right? In the domain in which he worked, James Flaherty works, it's coaching, but this can be applied to many different arenas of work and understanding. So he translated the 4 domains, the 4 quadrants from Ken Wilber's work into what now we know as human domains, which is what we're studying. And he says that the first domain, which is, we'll call it the I, it's about understanding our emotions, our thoughts, our identity. It's really our internal world as human beings. What is it? What are our beliefs? What are our values? How do we see ourselves in the world? So this is what we call the internal world of person, meaning that unless you ask somebody, you would not know, right? Then we move into the next domain, which is the body. And in the body, it's the external expression of this internal world. So in the internal world, I might have some thoughts and beliefs that manifest in a certain way in the external world, right? So for example, if I'm someone who tends to be anxious or worry about things all the time, internal world, right? My emotions, what I think. It might manifest in my body with tension. Maybe I tend to shake my hands all the time. Maybe I move fast all the time in my actions. Or maybe I don't move at all, right? Maybe I'm paralyzed because I'm afraid of what might happen. You see how these two start relating to one another? My thoughts, my emotions start informing the way in which I act in the world. The third domain is the domain of we, which is our relationships, our culture, our interconnection as human beings, right? So it's not just what I think, what I feel, how I act, but how do I act with other human beings? How do I communicate? What's my network of support? Do I have a spiritual practice, a spiritual community? How do I relate to others around me? Am I someone who having a lot of people around stresses me, or do I find comfort in having people around me? Do I tend to isolate myself, or am I someone who likes being around others? How effective am I in managing conflict, asking for what I want, right? All this world of how do I communicate my wants and needs in this we world? How does my culture inform who I am? And there are all kinds of different cultures. Not only who I am, for example, I'm from Mexico, but also, there might be a culture around faculty of a university that I might be informed by, etc. What are the different ways in which I move in the social world? And then finally is the world of the it, which is our environment. How do we relate to our physical environment? And that could be either nature or that could be human made, like the chair where I'm sitting, the office where I work. Do I tend to be organized or disorganized? Do I use systems to support me in my work? For example, do you use your calendar to know when your assignments are due? Do you organize yourself about when you need to do your reading or your posting or whatever it is that you have to do? Right? How do you use the systems that are there to support you or not? So you can, maybe you have the experience of when you clean your house and it's all organized, and maybe you put some flowers in the room and it smells good and you can see the light coming into the room, your body starts relaxing. So you can see how all of this connects. Your body might start relaxing, your ideas might get clearer, you might feel more welcoming of others into your space, right? So even though I've put lines around that separate each of these domains, all of these domains connect to each other. So as we think about development, you could look at which of these domains you are the strongest at and which are you the weakest at, right? Maybe you spend a lot of time in relationships. You're really good at this, but you neglect the care of your own body, the care of your own self. You're too busy over here, right? Or maybe you're so obsessed about how clean and organized your house is and all of that, and you don't have time for any of the rest. So each of us has a different domain that we have most attachment to or much dominance of, and one that is the weakest at. So in order for us to develop as human beings, you want to spend time on the one that you feel the weakest at and start adopting practices that will support your development around those. So that's a way to use this model. The other way to use this model is when you're working with groups or with teams, you can adopt practices at each of these domains that balance the group in an integral way. We will talk more about working with groups later in the term, but I want to start giving you some seeds about the usefulness of this model. Um, Anyway, so I'm happy to answer any questions when we're in the discussion boards, and I hope you start enjoying playing with some of these models.